Good evening, and thank you for coming to my presentation on climate change versus humans. So let's jump right in with a quick introduction. Climate change is an ongoing issue that affects the world. So what is climate change? According to dictionary.com, the definition for climate change is a long-term change in the Earth's climate, especially a change due to an increase in the average atmospheric temperature. With this, we usually hear things like glaciers melting, rising sea level, or drought as a couple different examples of climate change that we hear about fairly regularly. So with that information, we have three primary goals to look at. We're going to look at how it affects people specifically. We'll take a look at how it affects national economies, and we'll take a look at how it affects global economies. So let's jump right in. How does climate change affect people? First and foremost, increased temperatures equal an increase in heat-related deaths. So an increase in heat-related deaths are things like deaths from heat stroke or dehydration, anything that would cause the body to overheat and therefore cease function, causing an individual to pass away. With this rise in heat-related deaths, we're seeing a rise in total deaths, as it's not playing the role of a balance between heat-related deaths versus cold-related deaths. It's just increasing heat-related deaths as a whole. So we're just seeing an increase in death as a whole based on the climate, which is absolutely an effect of climate change on people. And from there, we can also see an increase in waterborne bacteria. Waterborne bacteria thrive even better in a heated environment. So the increased heat therefore increases the growth rate of the bacteria. And then growth of bacteria is also affected by things like runoff that we're seeing from the increase in precipitation. We're seeing from the increase in melting snows. It just all trickles down back into our water systems and our waterways, and it helps those bacteria grow. It helps that algae grow, and it takes over and becomes toxic to the ecosystem that it's in because it takes valuable nutrition that the indigenous fish and plants need. But it also affects the people in those environments where they have to shut down lakes or test for pollutants, stop using watersheds, all for the safety of the people around it based off of the bacteria growth and its spiking. And then a third way it affects people is with our mental health. It causes stress in people to have to, see all these dramatic and drastic changes that are happening to the world that can all be linked back to climate change. It affects, an altered state of mind because people's mental illnesses can be affected by the heat as well. So from there, we have a couple quick charts to look at. The first one on the left side is an example of heat-related deaths linked to the 1995 Chicago heat wave, where they saw 465 increased deaths due to heat-related deaths, which you can see clearly in the chart. If you look, you can see the green line outlined, the average temperature and how it, fluctuates over time. And then we hit 7-11 and it just skyrockets. And right next to it, that red line that also peaks right there, you can see that is the increase of deaths due to heat. And then from there, we'll quickly move on to the table on the right and look at how it affects the rising CO2 and how that affects the people. So the rise in temperature and precipitation can cause things like flooding, which cause the things that we put on our crops, like weed killer, insecticides, pesticides, to then run off into the water systems. It causes a rise in carbon dioxide, which then alters the nutrition in food. And the warmer temperatures cause it to spoil a lot faster. with food spoiling faster, we then have to be able to distribute it faster, which overall increases the amount of money taken to not only produce it, but the alteration to the food, and therefore affects the people because it increases the amount of money that they then have to spend for the end good. So from there, that's a perfect transition into how does climate change affect the national economy. We can start off by talking about agricultural damage. So we just mentioned before that it, increases the rate of spoilage, it increases the different kinds of runoffs that we're creating, which causes different issues as far as nutritional value in the food. But heat also affects the growth seasons. It changes what seasons things grow in, how effectively they're growing, the amount we can put into a crop. It can affect, whether we're having a drought. The increased precipitation can drown plants. So increase in climate change absolutely affects the environment in several different forms, therefore changing the amount of money that we have to put into it, which then affects the economies around us. With that, we also have the rising sea levels, where that affects places like Venice, Italy, or Florida, where there are these two beautiful places that are at or below sea level that once coexisted so beautifully with, being in the water. Venice is known for being on the canals, but they're now seeing extreme flooding. Venice is actually projected to, in the next 100 or so years, be completely flooded, which is damaging to the Italian economic system because it's no longer going to be a place of tourism, which is my third point. Tourism is an unlikely but definitely a part of a national economy that is affected by climate change, especially in places like Curacao, which is a small island in the Dutch Caribbean whose entire economy is based on tourism. And the effects that we're seeing from climate change, like the increase in heat, doesn't allow tourists to go out and enjoy their natural environments, to go hiking with heat advisories. It affects, cruise lines, and the storms blowing through affect whether or not they can dock. The damage that we're seeing to the coral reefs based on the increase in heat in the ocean affects scuba diving culture. So overall, take away tourism, you could absolutely cripple the economy of Curacao, which is why climate change is absolutely a huge effect on the national economy. Real quick, I have a couple charts that show, just the projected potential changes for the United States specifically. And the two that I really want to look at are the coldest night of the year, which is that top left chart, and that one shows you an increased chance of having cold nights in the northern part of the United States, which makes sense. We're closer to the north, but that affects our agriculture. So like in the Finger Lakes, we have grapes that grow in the later half of the fall, but if winter comes early, they're going to be damaged by frost, and that means we'll lose that product, which we then turn into wine. And a loss of wine means changing in the economy for wine growers, increased prices in wines, change in labor, so it affects the economy as a whole. And then the other one I want to look at is in the bottom right corner, which is the longest dry spell, which seems to affect mostly the West Coast, which is already prone to damage due to things like wildfires that have gotten out of control. And these increased dry spells are not going to help that. So as an effect to the changes that we've made in the climate, we are definitely seeing the damages left behind by it. So from there, we can look at it as a global level. So how does climate change affect the global economy? Well, first and foremost, inflation. Food prices go up. Everything goes up. So travel goes up. People are traveling less because it's more expensive to travel. Higher costs equal higher insurance. It's harder to, keep insurance if the prices keep going up. And that's a direct link to climate change. As, our environment needs to increase in pay, we have to pay higher premiums. And with the increased death rates that we're seeing, or the increased risk due to climate change, it definitely affects the global economy. But it all is going to affect us differently. So, regional effect is a huge thing. It's not going to affect just developing countries. Climate change affects all the countries, which you can see in my chart here in the bottom corner. It shows just kind of a general list of the world and how vulnerable they are due to the issues of climate change. So we'll see how the US isn't really considered vulnerable, but we do have a large percent of Asian countries are considered very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So where they might not be producing all of it, it might just be developing countries. They're still going to see the negative effects of climate change. And the other part is climate damage function, which is a mathematical equation that allows us to estimate what the tipping point is going to be. And looking back at the chart here on the top, it shows that we're getting really close. We're getting, shorter and shorter within degrees as far as mapping out how close we are to hitting peak climate change and its devastating results. So as a summary, climate change affects humans on many levels. It affects the people, it affects the national economy, and it affects the global economy.